For nearly 2 decades, Mark Harmon was more than the face of a television show. He was its gravity. Week after week, viewers didn't just follow cases, they followed the quiet weight carried by one man who rarely raised his voice but always carried the room. When he stepped away, it wasn't just a character that disappeared. It was a presence. And for years, fans were left wondering what truly pushed him to walk away from something he helped build. When a role becomes a life. When NCIS first appeared, no one imagined it would become one of the longest-running dramas in television history, and no one imagined that Leroy Jethro Gibbs would become one of the most enduring characters ever created for network television. Introduced quietly through a backdoor appearance on JAG, Gibbs was not written as a flashy hero. He was restrained, emotionally sealed, and shaped by loss. That restraint became the soul of the series, and over time, it became inseparable from Mark Harmon himself. From the beginning, Harmon approached the role with discipline rather than ego. He wasn't interested in speeches or grandstanding. He built Gibbs through silence, repetition, and internal pressure. As the show grew, so did the demands. NCIS moved into a production rhythm few actors can sustain for long periods. Long shooting days, relentless schedules, and the expectation that the lead actor would anchor every storyline. Harmon wasn't just acting. He was carrying the show structurally, emotionally, and creatively. As seasons passed, the boundary between actor and character began to blur. Harmon later acknowledged that what kept him returning year after year wasn't fame or security, but the challenge of keeping Gibbs honest and evolving. But that challenge came at a cost. The workload was intense from the very start. He has recalled that the first day on the job stretched into a grueling marathon, a warning sign of what the years ahead would demand. For the first several seasons, those days were not the exception. They were the rule. Behind the scenes, Harmon also took on responsibility beyond the screen. As an executive producer, he was deeply involved in protecting the tone of the show, the discipline of the set, and the consistency of the character. Loyalty became a defining trait, to the crew, to the writers, and to the story. But loyalty, when stretched across nearly 2 decades, can quietly turn into endurance. And endurance, left unchecked, becomes exhaustion. As the cast around him began to change, as familiar faces left and story dynamics shifted, Harmon remained. Not because it was easy, but because he believed the show still deserved stability. Yet with each passing season, the question grew harder to ignore. How long can one man keep carrying the weight of a character built on pain, control, and emotional isolation without paying a personal price? That question would eventually shape everything that came next. The weight that never left. By the time NCIS crossed into its second decade, the show no longer felt like a job. It felt like a responsibility that never switched off. Mark Harmon was no longer just playing Leroy Jethro Gibbs. He was protecting the rhythm of a machine that depended on him showing up, day after day, without fail. That kind of pressure doesn't announce itself loudly. It accumulates quietly, settling into routine until exhaustion becomes normal. Years after stepping away, Harmon finally admitted what many suspected but few heard him say out loud. He was tired, not bored, not ungrateful, just worn down by the relentlessness of the schedule. He recalled early days when shooting stretched far beyond reason, when 20-hour workdays weren't rare but expected. What began as commitment slowly turned into physical and mental depletion. And yet, he stayed. Part of that decision was rooted in loyalty. Harmon had always been protective of the crew, many of whom had built their lives around the show's demanding schedule. Walking away wasn't just a career move, it meant disrupting an ecosystem that had survived because of consistency. As executive producer, he felt that responsibility deeply. Leaving too soon would feel like abandonment. Staying too long, however, meant sacrificing parts of himself that no audience ever saw. Age also changed the equation. As Harmon approached his 70s, the physical demands of the role became harder to ignore. Gibbs was never written as a passive character. Even in quiet moments, he carried tension, standing for hours, enduring action sequences, repeating emotionally heavy scenes. Harmon later acknowledged that he wasn't just aging as a man, but as the character. What Gibbs was able to endure early on no longer felt truthful without consequence. At the same time, his priorities outside the show became harder to postpone. Time with his wife and children was no longer something he wanted to schedule around production blocks. It became non-negotiable. The question was no longer whether NCIS could continue without him. It was whether he could continue without stepping away. What makes this period especially tragic is that there was no dramatic breaking point, no scandal, no abrupt exit. Just a gradual realization that staying for the sake of habit would eventually erode the honesty he valued most in the character. And for an actor who built Gibbs on authenticity rather than spectacle, that erosion mattered. By the time the writers began shaping an exit, Harmon wasn't running away. He was preparing to let go, carefully, deliberately, and without burning the bridge behind him. A goodbye that wasn't a retirement. When Mark Harmon finally stepped away on screen, NCIS did not give Leroy Jethro Gibbs a heroic death or a ceremonial retirement. Instead, the show chose something far quieter and far more revealing. In the episode Great Wide Open, Gibbs travels to Alaska to close a case that mirrors his own internal state: isolation, unresolved pain, and a search for something that can't be named. The choice was deliberate. Rather than returning to Washington, Gibbs stays behind. No badge turned in with finality. No farewell speech to the entire team. Just a decision made in stillness. Harmon later clarified that this mattered deeply to him. Gibbs wasn't walking away because he was finished. He was walking away because he couldn't continue pretending that nothing inside him had changed. The scene with McGee crystallizes this truth. Standing in the water, fishing, Gibbs expresses gratitude for years of trust and shared work. It isn't dramatic. It's restrained, the same way Gibbs has always processed emotion. For many viewers, it felt incomplete. For Harmon, it was honest. The character wasn't healed. He wasn't free of grief. He was simply choosing not to carry the weight anymore in the same way. Producers were careful with the language surrounding his exit. Gibbs did not retire, he stayed. That distinction left the door open without making promises. Executive producer Steve Binder later emphasized that fans should never completely count Gibbs out. It was not a tease. It was an acknowledgement that the character's story wasn't closed, only paused. Behind the scenes, Harmon's name continued to appear in the opening credits even after his last physical appearance. For many fans, that detail felt confusing. For others, it felt comforting. It suggested continuity, a reminder that although Gibbs was no longer visible, he was still part of the show's DNA. When his name was eventually removed, the absence felt final, in a way the episode itself had not. This slow separation mirrored Harmon's real-life departure. He didn't vanish. He stepped back. He remained connected as an executive producer, guiding the tone from a distance. The separation was intentional, gradual, and emotionally restrained, just like Gibbs himself. What made this goodbye especially painful for fans was that it didn't offer closure in the traditional sense. There was no moment where grief resolved, no promise that everything would be okay. Instead, the show acknowledged something far more uncomfortable. Sometimes the bravest decision isn't to stay, but to stop pretending you still can. The void he left behind. When Mark Harmon finally disappeared from the weekly rhythm of NCIS, the reaction was immediate and deeply divided. For some viewers, the show could continue. The cases would still be solved. New characters would step in. But for many others, something fundamental had shifted. Gibbs wasn't just another lead character. He had been the moral center, the silent compass that anchored every room he entered. What followed was not outrage, but grief. Fans spoke about the absence the way people speak about losing routine, safety, and familiarity. After nearly 20 years of seeing Harmon's name in the opening credits, its eventual removal felt jarring. Some described it as bittersweet. Others described it as wrong. The show still existed, but it no longer felt whole. Part of the difficulty was that Gibbs had never been designed to be replaced. His authority came from restraint, not command, from consistency, not charisma. Any attempt to recreate that presence would feel artificial, and NCIS didn't try. Instead, it adjusted. The tone shifted. The leadership dynamic changed. The show moved forward, but it did so with a visible scar. Behind the scenes, the cast felt the loss just as deeply. Sean Murray, who had grown from a supporting player into a central figure alongside Harmon, later admitted that filming their final scene together was emotionally overwhelming. It wasn't just a farewell between characters, it was a goodbye between mentor and student, built over nearly 2 decades of shared work. The moment was quiet, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. What made the reaction more complex was the knowledge that Harmon hadn't left in anger or conflict. This wasn't a dramatic breakup. It was a necessary separation, and that truth made it harder for fans to process. There was no villain, no scandal to blame, just the reality that endurance has limits, even for the most disciplined figures. As NCIS moved into its next phase, viewers were left negotiating their own relationship with the show. Some stayed, some left. Others continued watching while quietly mourning what had been lost. The absence of Gibbs became a presence in itself, a reminder of how deeply a single character can shape the emotional identity of a series. And yet, even in absence, Harmon's influence lingered, in the pacing, in the restraint, in the way the show continued to treat silence as meaningful. Gibbs was gone, but he hadn't vanished. I was just tired. For a long time after stepping away, Mark Harmon said very little. That silence felt familiar to fans. It mirrored the character he had played for so long. Gibbs never explained himself unless he had to, and neither did Harmon. But when he finally spoke, the truth was simpler and heavier than many expected. In a candid moment years after leaving the show, Harmon admitted that exhaustion played a larger role than he had ever publicly acknowledged. He didn't frame it as burnout in the dramatic sense. He framed it as accumulation, years of early mornings, late nights, emotional restraint, and the constant expectation to lead, not just on screen but on set. What began as dedication eventually became fatigue that could no longer be ignored. He reflected on the reality of those early days, when long hours were normalized and endurance was worn like a badge of honor. At the time, he accepted it. The show was growing. The responsibility felt worth it. But as the years passed, the cost became clearer. What had once felt manageable began to feel unsustainable, and pretending otherwise would have meant betraying the honesty he valued most in his work. Later, Harmon clarified that his departure was not a dramatic exit, but a decision rooted in timing. He described it as pushing away rather than leaving, a subtle but important distinction. The story arc the writers created for Gibbs felt right to him. It acknowledged change without erasing history. It allowed the character to evolve without forcing a conclusion that felt false. What stands out in these reflections is the absence of bitterness. Harmon never spoke negatively about the show, the cast, or the audience. Instead, he expressed gratitude for the opportunity, for the longevity, and for the people who made the journey possible. He recognized how rare it is for a series to endure as long as NCIS has, and how much collective effort that endurance requires. Most tellingly, Harmon emphasized that stepping away did not mean walking away from acting or from Gibbs. He had left the show, not retired. That distinction mattered. It reframed his departure not as an ending, but as a necessary pause. A moment to reclaim time, energy, and balance after years of carrying a character built on control and loss. In that honesty, fans finally heard what Gibbs himself might have said if he ever allowed himself to speak freely. Sometimes strength isn't staying. Sometimes it's knowing when to stop. He never really left. Even after Mark Harmon stepped away from the weekly grind of NCIS, the idea that he had truly disappeared never felt accurate. Behind the scenes, his connection to the franchise remained intact. He continued as an executive producer, quietly shaping the world he helped build, without placing himself back at the center of it. That distance was intentional. It allowed the show to move forward while preserving the integrity of the character he spent nearly 20 years creating. That balance became clearer with the launch of NCIS, Origins. Set years before the event's audiences knew so well, the series explored a younger version of Gibbs, not as a legend, but as a man still learning how to carry loss, authority, and responsibility. Harmon did not return to the screen in the traditional sense. Instead, he narrated the story, guiding it from the margins. It was a fitting evolution. Gibbs had always been more voice than presence, more weight than spectacle. For fans, this continuation reframed his departure. Gibbs didn't vanish. He aged, retreated, and transformed, just as Harmon did. The character's decision to stay in Alaska now reads less like an ending and more like a mirror of the actor's own choice, to step back, to live differently, to stop measuring worth by endurance alone. What makes this story tragic isn't that Gibbs left. It's that he stayed for so long because he believed he had to. And when he finally allowed himself to stop, the absence revealed just how much he had been carrying, for the show, for the audience, and for himself. Mark Harmon didn't leave NCIS because he stopped caring. He left because caring had cost him more than he was willing to lose, and in doing so, he gave the character something rare in television. An exit rooted not in drama, but in truth. Do you think Mark Harmon made the right choice by stepping away when he did? Or should Gibbs have stayed longer? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more deep dives into the moments that changed television forever.